Hollywood has long trained audiences to believe that criminal power carries a built-in expiration date, that excess inevitably collapses under its own weight, and that violence always circles back to destroy the person who unleashed it. That promise feels reassuring, especially in stories set against neon skylines and fast money, where ambition burns bright and ends loudly. But history does not follow screenwriting rules. In Miami, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, crime did not merely rise, it settled in, adapting to institutions that were unprepared, compromised, or quietly benefiting from the flood of cash moving through the city. Cocaine was no longer just a drug. It was an economic force, reshaping banks, real estate, law enforcement priorities, and social boundaries. In that environment emerged Mario Tabraue, a figure often reduced to a footnote behind a fictional legend, yet far more revealing than any movie character. This is not a story about cinematic excess or stylized violence, but about how a system can absorb crime without collapsing, and how a man learned to survive not by fighting the state, but by understanding it. The uncomfortable question at the center of this investigation is simple and dangerous. What happens when power doesn't fall but learns how to adapt? What allowed Mario Tabraue to operate was not chaos, but conditions. And those conditions were firmly in place in Miami, long before his name ever appeared in a courtroom. By the late 1970s, the city had become a convergence point for geography, money, and institutional fatigue, a place where cocaine routes from Latin America met a financial system eager for deposits and growth at any cost. Billions of dollars in cash moved through banks, construction firms, car dealerships, and import businesses, often faster than regulators could trace, and with far fewer questions than the public ever imagined. Law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed, under-coordinated, and pressured to produce results without destabilizing an economy that was suddenly booming. In this landscape, crime did not need to hide, it only needed to blend in. The most successful operators were not those who dominated the streets, but those who understood flow, how money entered, how it was cleaned, and how it exited looking legitimate. This was the ecosystem that rewarded discipline over spectacle and patience over aggression. And it created a simple truth that would define the era. When illegal money becomes indispensable, the system stops asking where it comes from. In that environment, Mario Tabraue did not rise by behaving like a traditional gangster, because the conditions no longer rewarded impulsiveness or public violence. He understood early that power in Miami was no longer about territory, but about organization, and while others chased notoriety, he focused on structure. By his early 22nd, he was already coordinating shipments, payments, and protection across multiple jurisdictions, not through intimidation alone, but through delegation and compartmentalization. Associates rarely saw the full picture, and that distance was intentional, designed to limit exposure while maximizing control. What set him apart was not brutality, but discipline, a willingness to let systems do the work rather than his own hands. He surrounded himself with professionals, legal fronts, and intermediaries who understood that efficiency mattered more than loyalty. This approach allowed him to scale rapidly while remaining insulated, turning what looked like chaos from the outside into a carefully managed operation. In many ways, Mario Tabraue did not exploit the system. He mirrored it, adopting its logic and pace, until the line between legitimate enterprise and criminal organization became increasingly difficult to see. By the time Mario Tabraue reached his peak, power in Miami no longer announced itself with gunfire or street wars, but through access, silence, and shared benefit, and no place embodied that collapse of boundaries more clearly than the Mutiny Hotel. To outsiders, it looked like a luxury destination for nightlife and excess, but in reality it functioned as a neutral zone where social roles quietly dissolved. Judges, federal agents, local police, businessmen, smugglers, and celebrities occupied the same rooms, drank at the same bars, and learned to look the other way. This was not corruption driven by desperation. It was coexistence, built on the unspoken understanding that everyone present benefited from the same invisible economy. For Mario Tabraue, the mutiny was never about indulgence. It was about positioning, about being seen as unavoidable rather than threatening. When power becomes familiar, it becomes tolerated, and when it is tolerated long enough, it becomes protected. That protection did not rely on contracts or written agreements, but on mutual risk, because exposing one player meant exposing them all. Control in this world was psychological before it was physical, and Mario understood that fear works best when it is implied, not declared. His use of exotic animals, often dismissed as eccentric or theatrical, served a calculated purpose, reinforcing the idea that normal limits did not apply to him, that consequences were negotiable, and that proximity itself carried danger. These symbols were not meant to impress rivals, but to unsettle witnesses, to create hesitation where certainty should exist. In an environment where law enforcement was already compromised by overload and selective blindness, hesitation was often enough. The more Mario embedded himself into the social and economic fabric of the city, the harder it became to isolate him without destabilizing entire networks. This is how control truly worked, not through constant violence, but through inertia, the resistance of systems that no longer wanted disruption. By the early 1980s, Mario Tabraue was not simply a criminal operating within Miami. He was a variable the city had adjusted around, a presence accounted for in business decisions, enforcement priorities, and unspoken rules. And once power reaches that stage, removing it no longer feels like justice. It feels like risk, a calculation institutions hesitate to make until they have no other choice. Power built on control can tolerate many threats, but it cannot survive uncertainty. And for Mario Tabraue, nothing represented uncertainty more clearly than the presence of an informant. By 1980, his organization had reached a scale where information itself became the most dangerous currency, because a single leak could expose roots, finances, and the fragile alliances that kept the system intact. In this world, betrayal was not interpreted as a moral failure, but as an operational risk, something to be neutralized before it spread. The moment Mario's network identified a potential informant, the logic shifted from expansion to containment, from growth to preservation. What followed was not impulsive rage, but a cold calculation shaped by paranoia, intelligence failures, and the belief that hesitation would invite collapse. This was the point where violence stopped being reactive and became procedural, an internal mechanism designed to enforce discipline and deterrence at the highest level. Unlike the fictional narratives that frame such moments as emotional turning points, reality offered no dramatic pause. Decisions were discussed quietly, responsibilities distributed, and consequences assigned without spectacle. The goal was not revenge, but finality, the elimination of doubt within the organization. This was the moment when Mario's role shifted irreversibly, not because he suddenly became violent, but because violence became an accepted tool of management. When organizations reach this stage, brutality no longer shocks those inside them. It reassures them. Fear stabilizes loyalty, and silence becomes a survival strategy rather than a moral choice. The act itself mattered less than the message it sent. Cooperation with authorities would not merely end participation, it would erase existence. What makes this moment significant is not the crime, but the reaction of the system around it. Despite the severity of what occurred, there was no immediate reckoning. Investigations stalled, information fragmented, and institutions struggled to respond to a threat they could not fully map. The absence of swift consequences reinforced the belief that the strategy worked, that decisive cruelty prevented further risk. For Mario Tabraue, this reinforced a dangerous lesson. Escalation did not invite collapse, it invited caution from those tasked with stopping him. Each successful act of suppression deepened his confidence that the system preferred stability over confrontation. This was the psychological breaking point, not just for Mario, but for the ecosystem that enabled him. Once a criminal organization proves it can eliminate threats without immediate retaliation, it stops behaving defensively and begins to operate with assumed immunity. At that stage, law enforcement is no longer perceived as an adversary, but as a delayed variable, something to be managed through time, leverage, and negotiation. The line crossed in 1980 was not simply ethical, it was strategic, marking the transition from survival to dominance. From that moment forward, Mario Tabraue was no longer testing the limits of the system. He was betting on its reluctance to act. This shift set the stage for everything that followed. Violence had proven effective, silence had proven durable, and fear had proven scalable. Yet this success carried its own contradiction, because the more absolute the control became, the more visible the organization grew. Paranoia intensified, internal trust eroded, and the very measures designed to secure power began to generate the evidence that would eventually attract federal attention. The system had not yet moved, but it had begun to notice, and once that happened, the balance between containment and exposure started to tilt. By the mid-1980 seconds, the balance that had protected Mario Tabraue began to shift, not because the system suddenly found its conscience, but because the scale of the operation had grown too large to ignore. What once appeared as fragmented incidents now formed a recognizable pattern, connecting shipments, financial transfers, and compromised officials into a structure federal authorities could no longer dismiss as isolated corruption. The response did not come quickly or cleanly. It arrived cautiously, shaped by years of institutional hesitation and the recognition that confronting such a network carried consequences far beyond a single arrest. When federal agencies finally moved, it was not driven by outrage, but by accumulation, the slow realization that containment had failed and visibility had become unavoidable. The investigation that followed was methodical rather than dramatic, relying on surveillance, financial analysis, and testimony gathered over time. This was not a heroic charge against evil, but a bureaucratic grind against complexity. Prosecutors understood that dismantling the organization required more than proving violence. It required exposing systemic dependence, the ways in which legitimate institutions had quietly adjusted to criminal money. Every lead threatened to implicate not only traffickers, but bankers, contractors, and officials whose cooperation had blurred the line between negligence and complicity. As a result, the case advanced carefully, prioritizing certainty over speed, because a failed prosecution would reinforce the very immunity it sought to dismantle. When the arrests finally came, they were presented as a decisive strike, a signal that the era of tolerance had ended. Headlines framed the operation as a turning point, and Mario Tabraue was portrayed as a central figure in one of the most significant criminal enterprises ever uncovered on American soil. The courtroom narrative emphasized scale, reach, and authority, positioning him not as a rogue criminal, but as an organizer who had leveraged the weaknesses of the state itself. Yet even at this moment, the response revealed its limits. The charges were severe, the rhetoric uncompromising, but the process remained grounded in negotiation, because the system understood that total confrontation risked unraveling more than it could control. This tension shaped the trial and the sentencing that followed. While public statements emphasized justice and accountability, private calculations focused on leverage. Information became valuable, cooperation became possible, and punishment became flexible. The state was not simply seeking to punish Mario Tabraue. It was seeking to learn from him, to extract intelligence that could stabilize the broader landscape of organized crime. This dual objective created a paradox at the heart of the case, where the pursuit of justice intersected with the pursuit of utility. The harsher the sentence appeared, the greater the incentive to bargain, and the more room there was for compromise behind closed doors. The outcome reflected this contradiction. Although Mario received a sentence that symbolized total defeat, exceeding 100 years, the reality behind the numbers was more complex. Such sentences are not only punishments, they are negotiating positions. starting points rather than conclusions. The state had finally asserted authority, but it had done so within a framework that allowed for revision, adjustment, and exchange. In that sense, the response was less a moral reckoning than a strategic recalibration, an attempt to reassert control without destabilizing the very institutions that had enabled the problem to grow. As the courtroom doors closed, it appeared that the system had won, that power had been confronted and contained. But beneath the surface, the same logic that had allowed Mario Tabraue to thrive was still in motion. The state had acted, but it had acted on its own terms, cautiously, pragmatically, and with an eye toward preservation rather than absolution. And that choice would define what came next. Stories like Scarface endure because they offer emotional closure, a clean arc where ambition collapses and violence consumes itself, reassuring audiences that the world ultimately corrects its own extremes. But the real story surrounding Mario Tabraue refuses that comfort. There is no final shootout, no moral symmetry, no moment where chaos is neatly punished. Instead, there is survival, adaptation, and reinvention. A reminder that power in the real world does not always fall. Sometimes it simply changes shape. What makes this story unsettling is not that a criminal escaped consequences, but that the system designed to prevent such outcomes proved willing to negotiate, to trade certainty for stability, and to accept an ending that felt administratively successful rather than morally complete. This is not a failure of one institution or one investigation, but a reflection of how modern power operates when money, information, and leverage intersect. Justice becomes conditional, accountability becomes strategic, and punishment becomes flexible when disruption carries too high a cost. The life Mario Tabraue built after prison forces a difficult question into the open, one that Hollywood prefers to avoid because it has no satisfying resolution. What does justice mean when the system benefits from compromise? If criminal power can be absorbed, managed, and eventually normalized, then the real danger is not the rise of figures like Mario, but the environment that learns to live with them. In the end, the myth comforts us because it tells us what we want to believe. The reality unsettles us because it shows what we have learned to tolerate. And that may be the most lasting legacy of this story. Not the violence, not the money, but the quiet realization that some stories do not end, they simply fade into acceptance.